I'm Mike Hawks.
And I'm Kevin Spangenberg.
Welcome to In Between Charges, the perfect podcast to listen to while waiting for your EV to charge.
We bring you all the information about what happens in between charges, behind your charge points, and behind the scenes of the EV ecosystem.
In today's episode, we want to dive into the impact of global net zero emission targets on two of the largest and arguably most significant industries in the race to net zero, the automotive and energy industries.
We are focusing on the UK and discussing the contrast to Europe in order to understand how both regions are faring and what strategies they're employing to protect, transform, and innovate in the face of challenging but necessary sustainability goals.
And to do so, we're joined by industry experts from Bird & Bird, George Mason, and Joshua Partridge. They'll be giving us some insights into new sustainability regulations in the automotive sector with a focus on the ZEV mandates and a peek into the latest developments in the energy sector in the UK.
So plug in and enjoy.
All right. So welcome to this episode of In Between Charges. I'm Mike, and of course, joined by our co-host, Kevin. Kevin, how are you?
Doing very well. Thank you, Mike.
Fantastic. Good. Bird & Bird is a leading international law firm with a focus on innovation and a deep understanding of the legal and regulatory frameworks surrounding sustainability. George is a senior associate specializing in the automotive, renewable infrastructure, technology, media, and telecom sectors. George, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
And Joshua is a senior commercial associate specializing in the energy sector with a specific focus on renewables and low carbon generation and technological developments impacting the energy industry. Joshua, welcome also to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Cool. So let's jump in and let's start, I think, with the automotive industry. So setting the scene a little bit from last year, the UK government, and George, you published a paper on this towards the middle of last year, were in the process of launching a series of regulations and legislation for the automotive industry with the intent of laying the groundwork for how OEMs essentially would phase out the sale of their new petrol and diesel cars by 2030. The automotive industry in the UK last year, it's fair to say, was definitely a mixed bag of results. So on the one hand, pretty challenging conditions, largely thought due to supply chain issues. UK saw pretty significant loss of the production volume. But on the other hand, a third of that production in 2022 was actually electric vehicles. And now January has shown some pretty positive signs of recovery. So perhaps that's a reflection of how the OEMs are already responding. But to begin with, George, can you give us a bit of an overview of the UK's regulatory landscape that's been built around the automotive industry as part of its net zero goals, and how are OEMs responding to that?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the ZEV mandate is, broadly speaking, is the sort of legislative design package to ensure that vehicle manufacturers are preparing for the bans on the sale of emission-producing vehicles from 2030. And it followed on from a CO2 emissions green paper. And the results of those were published in April last year. And in terms of where we are at now, we are waiting for the results of the ZEV mandate consultation paper to be published. The plan is for the draft statutory instrument to be laid before Parliament this year. And I think there are sort of two general areas that are probably worth discussing now. And the first, which was decided in the CO2 emissions green paper, was that vehicle manufacturers will need to produce a certain amount of zero emission vehicles a year. And then secondly, is that between 2030 and 2035, only the sale of new vehicles with significant zero emission capability will be permitted in the UK.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think ZEV has always been the big kind of discussion point that's coming up, and interesting to hear that conclusions have been deferred into this year. And of course, any manufacturer takes a long time to change their manufacturing process, their production process to meet it. So any delayed time also has knock-on effects on how quickly they need to or can essentially transform. Could you maybe share a little bit more details on what some of the conclusions or discussions within the mandate are still up for debate, and maybe why they are and how they're being discussed?
Yeah, sure. So the first, I guess, is around whether we would go for a CO2 emissions-based target structure or kind of zero emission vehicle sales target. And ultimately, it's been decided that the zero emission vehicle sales target would be better, because a lot of the respondents to the consultations felt that, under a CO2 emissions based sort of regime, there'd be multiple routes to ensure compliance with the targets. The consultation papers also discussed the sort of fines that would be potentially imposed, and also that, manufacturers will have their sale of zero emission vehicles converted into certificates and then be required to hold a certain amount of those certificates at the end of each year. Credits is another important area, and the Department for Transport has confirmed in the CO2 emissions green paper that a tradable credit-based framework will be adopted. So that's just a sort of handful of points which are, kind of up for discussion, and we're looking for more clarity on.
So, George, this consultation that we're waiting for, the ZEV consultation that's due to come out, I take it that applies to not only, it's applying to both cars manufactured in the UK as well as vehicles sold. And I was just wondering, do we see anticipation from OEMs and manufacturers across Europe that want to continue selling into the UK, which is obviously a very large market? And does the UK, with this ZEV mandate, have an opportunity to set a much higher standard that other manufacturers and OEMs might need to build to and adhere to, and can kind of raise the bar?
From everything, we've read about the ZEV mandate and the CO2 emissions papers and these consultations, they are trying to create a structure which is, the onus is on it being more simplified, easier to understand, therefore comply with. And compared to Europe, for example, I know 07 has recently been announced, which has not been well received at all by manufacturers across Europe. Again, it's all sort of subject to what the sort of final legislation looks like. But the onus really is on trying to be, as far as I can see, trying to be pragmatic.
Interesting how OEMs are starting to respond to the legislation here. I know that middle of last year, Toyota came out with a bit of a comment to say they would essentially pull out of the UK if the ZEV mandates was implemented, how it was originally being discussed. And so, for the UK, it's obviously a major industry that needs to be transformed to protect the industry itself, the exports, but also the production in market. How perhaps some of the conversations that you've had in the market, how does that compare with other OEMs?
Yeah, there are quite a few OEMs who have been pretty kind of positive about it, and have indeed sort of said that they're aiming to sort of beat the timeline. And so I think really what we're hearing in the market is that the plans are fine, they're quite ambitious, but it's the other stuff around the edges that they're more concerned about. And that's the cost of manufacturing. That's having enough support to convert the workforce in time. It's the sort of government's willingness to sort of attract investors into the UK. It's all of the sort of incentivization side of things and the concerns around sort of supply chain issues, etc., which are really sort of crowding out as far as I can see in the media, sort of discussion around the ZEV mandate at this stage.
And you mentioned something also earlier. Obviously, the big part is powertrain. So zero emission vehicles, BEVs predominantly, PHEVs have a credit still associated with them, but it's a lower value relative to BEV. To what level of detail does the ZEV mandate go into specifics for the manufacturing of the car beyond the powertrain?
It does have a big kind of introduction that the desire is for the UK to sort of move away from reliance on energy from particularly sort of Russia as a result of the war in Ukraine, and to bring back energy independence to the UK.
The ZEV mandate, does it also address the funding, like you mentioned, the support that maybe the government will or will not provide to try to attract the necessary and investment and everything? Because I just think of we know kind of the big, I don't know, you could call it not a trade war, but sort of the protectionism concerns right now between the United States and Europe over the Inflation Reduction Act and then the EU just rolled out their response with the Green Deal industrial plan. Is there concern in the UK? You don't have to give me your political opinion or anything like that, but is there concern in the UK that maybe you'll get caught in the middle a little bit as the odd country out, and when it comes to big time investments for battery factories and all the like, as these big continental powers are throwing money at addressing these big issues?
Yeah, I think there is. I think there's a sort of general feeling, in the market that now is the time to really kind of strike and start kind of making the UK an attractive place for manufacturers of particularly sort of battery technology, because if they don't, then we'll potentially, miss the boat. Now, obviously, we're in a slightly sort of difficult position. The COO of Nissan, for example, I mean, Nissan, they build electric vehicles in the UK. He has said recently, I think it was this week, that really that the economics need to sort of balance before they can make any decision about the future. Because at the moment, the UK is a difficult place, or is perceived to be a difficult place to do business in terms of kind of creating or developing battery technology and electric vehicle manufacturing generally. I think that the UK government is looking to support the transformation via sort of separate legislation. And so there are quite a few sort of areas of discussion around how the UK government could support the EV production manufacturing market better in the UK to get more interest from the global community.
Yeah, I remember reading an article by Mike Hawes,
Yeah,
I believe is the chief exec of S1E4. And that was lobbying exactly for preferential incentives to boost production, but also making sure that there is sufficient incentive to bring people closer to purchasing an EV car as well, not just when their ICE vehicle, for example, is reaching end of life, but also trying to push that into the UK. So they're growing that market.
Yeah, well, there's certainly that as well. The UK government seems to sort of focus more heavily on sort of supporting kind of innovation and infrastructural development and R&D rather than sort of direct incentivization for consumers and businesses. So for example, Jeremy Hunt announced last year that electric car owners will have to pay vehicle excise duty from 2025. And they've taken away the sort of subsidy for buying electric vehicles. And then if you look at Germany, for example, they actually offer incentives of up to €9,000. It's a slightly different approach than how a lot of countries in Europe are approaching things.
We had a couple of other questions starting relate into consolidation in the market. It's how we kind of want to frame this already. It's a very complex landscape to try to navigate. Different OEMs have started essentially their R&D and also their development process much earlier. How do you think that race is going to go between now and 2030? And how will things like the ZEV mandate start to impact consolidation, not just within manufacturers who are developing light commercial vehicles, but also those, as you mentioned, who are perhaps focused predominantly on 2 or 3 wheelers and are even further behind as a result?
Yeah, I think it'll have a huge effect. And we're already seeing that in the market. You're seeing traditional car makers, very much sort of rubbing shoulders with cutting edge sort of startups and sort of tech giants. And then also those in the mining industry who, have access to reserves of lithium or who are sort of involved in that kind of supply chain. I think it's probably also worth mentioning the rules of origin, which is very relevant to this discussion because under the cooperation and trade agreement that we have with the EU, it sets the limits on what proportion of those components can be made outside of Europe. And currently it's 60% is the sort of initial threshold. So that requires at least 40% of the components to be made locally. And that's obviously very important, particularly in relation to sort of battery technology, where we seem to be sort of lagging behind.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting and maybe relates back to Kevin's point around protectionism that's made earlier. We've just seen about a week ago from the time of recording, General Motors has invested in a lithium site out in the US, essentially starting to operate a bit of a land grab to be able to meet those targets now and in the future.
If you could just, in a few sentences, kind of sum up when kind of we can expect this consultation to come out and kind of just the quick nuts and bolts of what we can expect it to really outline and what it will mean maybe for the consumer as well.
It's a little hard to know at the moment exactly when we're going to hear. As I said before, the draft statutory instrument does need to be laid before Parliament this year if they're going to hit the target of coming to law at the beginning of January 2024. I think generally speaking, there has been quite a rapid uptake and interest in people who are acquiring, electric vehicles.
Perhaps you can comment to this or not. What's the advice that you give investors at the moment relative to OEMs, auto manufacturers in the UK?
What we have seen in London is, we've seen quite a bit of investment from private equity houses, venture capitalists, but very much investing on sort of venture capital type terms because they do view it as it's a risky investment. It's very hard at the moment to be able to create a model as to exactly what the demand and usage of the sort of EV rollout sort of process will be. Without the legislation or the clarity around the legislation, it's a little difficult to create the models. And that's why I think we're seeing investment more on the sort of venture capital kind of minority sort of stake kind of terms than large scale sort of acquisitions or investment. Private investment in the UK has been cautious. Investors are exposed to unpredictable demand, and the UK is challenged on that because of a number of things. First, Brexit, and then COVID have severely disrupted supply chains. Manufacturing costs have also surged as a result of the war in Ukraine, and regardless, the UK has traditionally had much higher electricity prices than Europe. And, a manufacturer really looks first for places where manufacturing can be cost competitive. But that said, the pound slumping to 37-year lows last year against the US dollar represents a significant opportunity for foreign investors. And, the UK automotive industry does have a lot of strengths. It's very diverse. It has a sort of history of engineering excellence and innovation and a very, a highly skilled workforce. I think it's also important to mention the National Security and Investment Acts 2021 in the UK, because that's really relevant to investors in the UK automotive industry and something that we always assess now on any of our transactions because it has a very broad application. There are 17 qualifying sectors which potentially give rise to a mandatory filing where investors who acquire more than 25, 50 or 75% of the voting rights, or voting rights which give them the ability to block or pass resolutions, and also it has an application for asset acquisition. So it is very broad.
So now I think let's move on to the energy industry. Joshua, it'd be great to also get your kind of point of view here. Also just thinking about 2022, similar to automotive manufacturers, pretty challenging year. Big part of that, highly volatile conditions due to rising gas prices, increases in exports, etc. In the UK alone, we were checking this out this morning. Domestic gas and then electricity prices raised by 129% last year and then 66% respectively between October 2021 and October 2022. It'd be great to understand a little bit about how the energy market itself specifically works and that what led to such significant rises in prices and ongoing market volatility.
I think the energy market in itself is relatively complex and it comprises a number of different markets. I think the main one that's really come into focus and that has driven a lot of the price rises we see is the wholesale market. And part of the reason for that is that the energy prices in that wholesale market are set using what's called marginal cost pricing. That leads to a situation where essentially the most expensive type of energy used on the system sets the price for all types of energy. In the UK, although it's an increasing amount and we tend to generate about half of our energy from renewables, gas peaking plant is actually what is used to top up the system the majority of the time. And that's part of the reason in the last couple of years, those prices have risen so dramatically. I think it is important to say, we can come back to this, but it is important to say that this is something that is being looked at by, UK government and other governments around the world. But just going back to the pricing very quickly, what it does mean, the way it's set up at the moment, is that the price of renewables, so the sort of marginal cost of wind or solar is essentially free because the wind doesn't cost anything and the sun doesn't cost anything. What they have to pay back is their capital expenditure to build the plant in the first place. The full benefit of having those low marginal cost generation technologies in the system is not reflected in pricing. So consumers who are on sort of renewable only tariffs still pay the same price as if they were on gas in a lot of cases.
So that seems like a weird system to me. If half of the energy produced in the UK is renewable, how does that not serve as a major buffer against the really volatile prices and the really volatile markets going on in the other energy areas?
Yes, and I think a lot of people would agree that, I guess, on one sort of public perception side of things, you don't see the benefit of the lower price of the marginal cost of renewables. You also see lots of the big utilities making record profits off the back of high gas prices. What I would say is, it's not a UK specific thing. The majority of liberalized markets worldwide tend to use this sort of model so that the price effectively reflects, as I said, the cost of one additional unit of electricity at all times. The idea being that this, in theory, provides some efficiencies, transparencies, and also incentives to keep costs down because it's done on on an auction, a bid price basis. It has been based on a very centralized one-way flow of electricity. So now we are moving to a system which is much more based on renewables, so low carbon generation, which tends to be much smaller in terms of individual asset size. It tends to be much more distributed. So our electricity usage is increasing and key sectors are moving to use electricity as their primary source of energy. The two really big ones are electric vehicles and the heating industry as well. We also have a much smarter system. I think the proliferation of digitalization technologies means there's much more data going around in the system. So we can be much more granular about how we actually run that. And so we do have, whole market setup reviews. So I think we're at that threshold stage where we're trying to identify the best way of setting the market up for the future.
Yeah. That's fascinating because all things point to the need for a completely new operating model. And on one of the first discussions we were having was focused basically on the grid and how much this is going to disrupt the setup, not just for distribution system operators, but also the customer-facing utilities. It'd be great if you could give us an example of one of those tools or one of those methods which has come about recently to either help, increase the trading power of renewables within the market, for example, so it's not all based on price or how that might work.
There are a number of different ways of doing that are being considered. I think one of the key ways of driving forward renewables is how to continue to drive the investment in renewables. When we get to a more renewable-based future, there are modeled scenarios where when it's very windy or very sunny, or both at the same time, in fact, and we don't need that gas plant to top up what we've got. So we've already got some surplus generation from renewables. That can lead, because the marginal cost of renewables is so low, to huge price drops, which on the one hand is sort of price cannibalization. So there is that in itself disincentivizes the investment. So, there is a need to try to, mitigate against those price fluctuations and also to ensure that renewables get enough money to justify the investment that was put into them in the first place.
So we've talked a little bit about market reform that you've mentioned, Joshua, these fixed price type agreements. The second part to that is then, operating model reform or maybe source reform. So we talk about storage facilities, grids, creation of microgrids. Also, this topic of the virtual power plant came up previously with a conversation with Christopher Greason from Hybrid Green Tech back here. To what extent are you starting to see those emerge in the UK and have a real impact on stability of the grid and also people's consumption?
On the base, we have a set of hardware, which is a historic energy system. And we are at the point of digitalizing that system. So we are building a layer of digital technologies, whether those are, communication systems, data systems on top of that to enable the sort of smartening of the grid. And I think, people often talk about a smart grid, and I don't see that as a binary switch. You don't one day have a dumb grid and the next day have a smart grid. I think it's an incremental process where individual aspects of the grid become smarter and then they open up new uses of the data or the technology that's implemented in them. And in theory, it should all build on each other. And so you have a continually evolving grid that, is continually getting smarter, but also allows you to operate it and control it in a much more efficient way. I think in future, you will get much more granular and detailed tariffs that, if you're an EV user, might allow someone else, a third party, to control when your vehicle charges, perhaps when it discharges back into the gridding and take part in grid services. And so, there would need to be constraints around that because you don't want to get to your car and it's empty because someone's used it to do something fancy with the grid to keep it balanced. So there will be constraints, but I think we'll see much more of that type of offering coming into the market on the back of the sort of smart digitalization of the grid more generally.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. We're actually working on a beta project for that exact thing in Scandinavia, in a couple of our core markets up here where we have the right volume of users. And right now, I think we're offering them about between $10 to $15 a month, which is nothing, major, right? But also, I don't know that how many people are counting on that as a source of a revenue stream for your household. So anything is a little bit better than nothing if you really have to do very little. But that does require a lot of education for people and kind of pushing, because how many people are thinking, okay, I need to go buy an electric vehicle. I need to get the battery. I need to get the charge point. I need to get solar panels, and I need to do all these things to set up. We'd love it if everybody did that, but that's just not the case. So
I don't want to speak for the whole of industry or the whole of the government, but that is one of the key messages from consultations from governments around the world and from the utilities themselves, is that flexibility is actually going to mitigate the grid costs massively. And if you do that, one of the things you pay for in your electricity bill is a standing charge. And I think that's a really difficult sell to the public is, by doing this, you're actually mitigating the amount your energy bills will go up, because I don't think they have very much visibility of that. And I think there were early stage attempts to do very similar things to this. And there's sort of one famous example in the US where a utility offered its customers, we'll turn off your power for, half an hour, 5 times a year, and we'll give you $50. I forget the exact numbers, but, effectively the times when they turned off everyone's air conditioning was the 5 half an hours in the year when it was hottest. And that's sort of, the sort of thing where if you get the messaging and the mechanism wrong, that puts people off, because they feel as if they've been scammed, I guess, rather than they are creating a benefit for everyone else or a benefit for themselves even.
This is great. And Josh, I think I'm trying to structure then, I guess, the various ways that the broad energy industry, I appreciate that it's very complex and we put it in that term, it tends to oversimplify. But by the sounds of things, there are a few components. First one is market reform, essentially how energy is traded. And as part of that, trying to decouple the price from gas. So it gives renewables and other energy sources a little bit more presence in the market. They can have a much more competitive pricing, and that can also be passed on to the end consumer. So they're not just hitting that top price. The middle part also is then infrastructure, and not just infrastructure of the grid, but we're creating these distributed networks or opportunities. Could be an EV car, it could be a charge point, it could also be a storage facility that start to generate sufficient capacity in the grid when aggregated at scale across multiple different households, multiple different buildings. But I think the third part that we haven't really talked about yet, and you started to touch on it already with the example in kind of California, I guess, is really around consumption reform and how we choose to consume electricity and for what courses. The other part related to air conditioning is it's the whole dependence with gas in order to provide heating. And how are we going to be able to decarbonize that? I wonder if you can comment on that final topic. I mean, how are industries, organizations, utilities trying to address the dependency between gas and heat and trying to also electrify that product consumption?
I expect at some point in the future, we will see legislation that, effectively forces people to put in new boilers that are not gas ones. The technology is sort of, there or thereabouts. I mean, we do quite a lot of work with housing developers and big housing developments where they essentially, rather than putting boilers in each house, they put in district heating schemes. And a lot of what we're seeing there is the people running those networks are looking at future change and they're sort of future-proofing their contracts, because these tend to be quite long-term contracts. Everyone's considering this and not wanting to be left behind and wanting to future-proof their heat. But I think there will be legislation that comes out, and we're already seeing in the next year or so, there will be heat regulation in the UK. So we are going to have increasing regulation of heat. And so that might end up being more like an energy, like an electricity or gas or water market, where it's a highly regulated market. It needs that legislative or sort of regulatory layer, I think, in part to drive it. But I think, the industry as a whole is going into this eyes wide open, knowing that this is going to happen.
So then I think maybe just to round off the discussion on the energy industry, significant disruption that needs to happen over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. And maybe if you could, I think, give us just a really kind of quick statement of the biggest challenge that utility companies are facing and how they might overcome that in the next 5 years, that would be great.
Biggest challenge I think utility companies are facing is that they don't know quite yet what the framework's going to look like in 5-10 years' time. I think that's probably the biggest challenge, is not quite knowing. We'll see there's an extremely broad range of options on the table that will impact on every utility from top to bottom in the industry. There will be a lot of consultation in the next couple of years. I think there will be a lot of stakeholders in the industry putting across their views quite fervently.
To finish each episode, we like to ask our guests kind of the same question. So first, I'll pose that question to you, George. If you could dispel one myth about the EV industry or the kind of EV or electrical transformation that's taking place right now, what would it be?
I think it's fair to say that there is anxiety around range and fast charging, which is putting people off buying an electric vehicle in the UK. To a certain extent, I was one of them, and I hired an electric car the other day to take me to Cambridge. And the first question I asked was, will it get me there and back? And it's roughly 100 miles from London to Cambridge. And of course it did, and it came back with a quarter of a charge left. I think there really is a sort of degree of denial about battery electric vehicles, and that somehow they will be optional, but they are coming, and we will be driving them soon. So at the moment, the future really is battery electric. I think what we'll probably see is more of a concentration of hydrogen vehicles in sort of heavy industries, for example, in air and sea traffic, with the focus on continuing to develop and improve battery electric vehicles.
Obviously, we're in the EV industry, so we like electric vehicles. We'd like further adoption of that, but we are well aware of the other possible methods of fueling and everything that are out there. I would say if I were to have a hydrogen vehicle, I don't know where I would fill it up. So I like the electric vehicle. Yeah. It's kind of intuitive. You plug it in. I know how to do that. I do that with a lot of things every day. I would need to be retrained if it came to filling up something with hydrogen. Maybe it's available at a petrol station. I don't know. But cool. Thank you, George. Josh, we'll turn it over to you. I know you touched more about utilities. So maybe if you could dispel one myth about the electrification or the challenges or that utilities are facing or that we see in the utility industry and the transformation that's taking place there, what would it be?
So I think the biggest myth probably that I would like to dispel is what you see sometimes, that there's a green agenda that is just there to, squeeze more money out of the public. I think that is quite damaging because it gives the wrong impression, and the fact that the energy industry is quite so opaque to the public means it's quite hard to dispel that myth if someone's made their mind up. The energy industry globally is competing. There are several competing things happening. There is decarbonisation. There's a need to keep that decarbonisation affordable. And there's a need to maintain sort of security of supply. And those things don't always put in the right direction. But, the sort of the green agenda and decarbonisation is a key part of that. And, I'm quite a passionate sort of advocate of, decarbonising our energy industry. And I think that, prices may rise, but that's not the reason for the green agenda. There is a genuine want to decarbonise the way we produce our energy while we keep it affordable and keep the lights on, if you want to put it that way.
And I think it's also trying to communicate to people that the green agenda is something that people get to participate in and that they will be participating in, right? And it's not just, all right, let's wait for somebody else to figure it out. Obviously, big governmental plans like we've just discussed this whole episode are necessary, but also there's ways that we could all kind of participate in this as well and go and be proactive in, kind of doing our part too.
So thank you very much. Thanks very much, both, for the good discussion. I think we got some really great content out there. Hopefully it was good for you both. In Between Charges is a podcast produced by Monta, the charging software for all your EV needs. And we're really excited to announce that you'll be hearing from us again very, very soon. Next week, we'll be joined by Aaron Fishbone from Charge Up Europe and Greenway for some insights about the upcoming AFIR regulation and to learn more about the current state of affairs for CPOs throughout Europe. If you want to keep up with the latest news about the show, follow Monta on Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook.